Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, February 22nd, 2022. President Joe Biden imposing additional sanctions on Russian wealthy elites and their families, financial institutions in Russia, and the Russian sovereign debt, all in response to Russian President Vladimir Putin's recognizing two rebel-controlled areas of eastern Ukraine as independent countries and then sending in what Russia calls peacekeeping forces. President Biden referring to this as the beginning of an invasion of Ukraine. U.S. sanctions joining other coordinated sanctions from Great Britain and the European Union. Coming up, we'll hear from President Biden along with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, plus U.S. senators on the Foreign Relations Committee. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Ukraine's Foreign Minister, and the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Plus, we'll speak with Luke Coffey, a foreign policy expert at the Heritage Foundation. Also today, President Biden announcing steps aimed at shoring up the critical mineral supply chain in the U.S., minerals used in electric vehicles and renewable energy components, among other things. And guilty verdicts in the federal hate crimes trial of the three white men accused of following, confronting, and then killing black jogger Ahmaud Arbery 2 years ago. We'll get reaction from the Attorney General Merrick Garland and Arbery's mother, Wanda Cooper Jones, who is critical of the U.S. Justice Department for not wanting this to go to trial and instead wanting to accept the defendant's plea deal. From the New York Times, President Biden on Tuesday announced harsh new sanctions aimed at punishing Russia for what he called the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, joining European leaders in imposing severe economic consequences for blatant violations of national sovereignty. Speaking from the East Room of the White House, Mr. Biden condemned President Putin of Russia for his aggression against Ukraine, saying that the Russian action is a flagrant violation of international law and demands a firm response from the international community. Here's President Biden.
Yesterday, Vladimir Putin recognized two regions of Ukraine as independent states. And he bizarrely asserted that these regions are no longer part of Ukraine and their sovereign territory. To put it simply, Russia just announced that it is carving out a big chunk of Ukraine. Last night, Putin authorized Russian forces to deploy into these regions. Today, he asserted that these regions are actually extend deeper than the two areas he recognized, claiming large areas currently under the jurisdiction of the Ukraine government. He's setting up a rationale to take more territory by force, in my view. And if we listened to his speech last night, and many of you did, I know, he's setting up a rationale to go much further. This is the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, as he indicated and asked permission to be able to do from his Duma. So let's begin to, I'm going to begin to impose sanctions in response far beyond the steps we and our allies and partners implemented in 2014. And if Russia goes further with this invasion, we stand prepared to go further as with sanctions. Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belong to his neighbors? This is a flagrant violation of international law, and it demands a firm response from the international community. Over the last few months, we've coordinated closely with our NATO allies and partners in Europe and around the world to prepare that response. We've said all along, and I've told Putin to his face more than a month ago, that we would act together. And the moment Russia moved against Ukraine, Russia has now undeniably moved against Ukraine by declaring these independent states. So today, I'm announcing the first tranche of sanctions to impose costs on Russia in response to their actions yesterday. These have been closely coordinated with our allies and partners, and will continue to escalate sanctions if Russia escalates. We're implementing full blocking sanctions on two large Russian financial institutions, VEB and their military bank. We're implementing comprehensive sanctions on Russian sovereign debt. That means we've cut off Russia's government from Western financing. It can no longer raise money from the West and cannot trade in its new debt on our markets or European markets either. Starting tomorrow and continuing in the days ahead, we'll also impose sanctions on Russia's elites and their family members. They share in the corrupt gains of the Kremlin policies and should share in the pain as well. And because of Russia's actions, we've worked with Germany to ensure Nord Stream 2 will not, as I promised, will not move forward. As Russia contemplates its next move, we have our next move prepared as well. Russia will pay an even steeper price if it continues its aggression, including additional sanctions.
President Biden at the White House using that phrase, beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the recognition of the two breakaway areas of Ukraine as separate entities, as republics. Earlier today, Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner on CNN repeatedly used the word invasion. And at the time, CNN referred to it as a rhetorical shift by the Biden administration, which on Monday resisted calling Russia's moves into Ukraine an invasion, after warning for months about Moscow's military buildup and increasing aggression. President Biden today also warning that further military activity by Russia could raise energy prices worldwide, and that his administration has been taking steps to try to limit the impact on Americans at the gas pump and home heating oil. President ending his remarks today at the White House by letting President Putin know the diplomatic path is not completely cut off.
There is still time to avert the worst-case scenario that will bring untold suffering to millions of people if they move as suggested. The United States and our allies and partners remain open to diplomacy if it is serious. When all is said and done, we're going to judge Russia by its actions, not its words. And whatever Russia does next, we're ready to respond with unity, clarity, and conviction. We'll probably have more to say about this as it moves on. I'm hoping diplomacy is still available. Thank you all very much.
President Biden at the White House not answering any reporters' shouted questions at the end. You can find his full remarks at our video library, cspan.org. In Moscow, lawmakers there in the upper house, the Federation Council, voting unanimously to allow Russian President Vladimir Putin to use military force outside of Russia, in effect giving the stamp of approval to any Russian military deployment in those rebel areas of eastern Ukraine and maybe more. President Putin at a news conference today asked why he did recognize those separate republics.
Kiev started saying that they had no plans of implementing these agreements. They didn't want to, so what else was left to say? And they have stated that publicly. So what we were supposed to wait for? To wait that the people will be tortured, that this genocide will continue. Those people who live in those territories, it is impossible to continue to look at it idly. We couldn't stand it any longer. That's the extent of it. Our colleagues from Europe, our counterparts, when we talked to them, they said the same thing. Yes, that's the path to follow, but they couldn't force them, their partners from the current leadership of Ukraine, to do this. So we were forced to make that decision. And in this sense, yes, the Minsk agreements, they don't exist. So why should they be implemented if we recognize these republics now?
That's President Putin in Moscow at a news conference. He also ratified friendship treaties with those two breakaway republics, Donetsk and Lugansk, allowing Russia to build military bases there, deploy troops, and agreed to a joint defense posture, also tighten economic integration. Ahead of President Biden's remarks mid-afternoon about new sanctions against Russia, the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell telling a luncheon in Lexington, Kentucky, his home state, what I hope he's saying, referring to President Biden, what I hope he's saying right now is that from a sanctions point of view, we're going to impose the toughest possible sanctions. McConnell also calling for canceling completely the Nord Stream 2 pipeline extending from Russia to Germany, saying not now, not tomorrow, not ever. Senator Robert Menendez is chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, Democrat from New Jersey. He was on CNN Tuesday afternoon right before President Biden spoke, expressing hope that the sanctions imposed on Russia would be severe.
I think they need to be severe sanctions. I think we can stop equivocating as to whether we have an invasion or not. I think the West, the United States, has to make it very clear to Putin that the consequences begin now. And for me, that means taking, for example, the waivers off on Nord Stream. So that's definitely dead. It means sanctioning Russian banks. It means sanctioning Russian oligarchs that are holding Putin's monies. It also means sanctioning Russian sovereign debt those are just some of the beginning salvos that I think need to be done. And I hope it will be done multilaterally, because unless the West this time acts resolutely, strongly, and decisively, we will have repeats of 2008 and 2014 with Putin.
Senator Robert Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee on CNN, right before President Biden spoke. The House and Senate not in session this week. They went out for a break before agreeing to, in the Senate anyway, a tough sanctions package against Russia. There was some disagreement about whether the sanctions should be imposed now or if Russia took further military action. Ahead of the developments of the past 24 hours, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had been scheduled to meet with his Russian counterpart, the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, in Geneva to talk about resolving the tensions between Russia and Ukraine without more bloodshed. Today, Secretary Blinken saying that meeting is now canceled.
Last week, I agreed to meet Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov this week on February 24th to discuss our countries' respective concerns about European security, but only if Russia did not invade Ukraine. Now that we see the invasion is beginning and Russia has made clear its wholesale rejection of diplomacy, it does not make sense to go forward with that meeting at this time. I consulted with our allies and partners, all agreed. And today I sent Foreign Minister Lavrov a letter informing him of this. The United States and I personally remain committed to diplomacy if Russia is prepared to take demonstrable steps to provide the international community with any degree of confidence that it's serious about de-escalating and finding a diplomatic solution. We will proceed in coordination with allies and partners based on Russia's actions and the facts on the ground. But we will not allow Russia to claim the pretense of diplomacy at the same time it accelerates its march down the path of conflict and war.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at a joint news conference with the visiting Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba at the State Department in Washington. Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying today that it's pulling its diplomatic staff from Ukraine, citing threats of physical violence and repeated attacks against those diplomats. That Ukrainian foreign minister also held meetings with President Biden at the White House today and at the Pentagon with the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. Secretary Austin promising the U.S. would stand by its ally Ukraine. And for the foreign minister, he said a strong Ukraine is the best deterrence against Russia.
Minister Kuleba, it's an honor to welcome you back to the Pentagon at this critical moment in history. As we meet today, Russia's latest invasion is threatening the peace, security, and prosperity of Ukraine and of the transatlantic community. I know that we've all heard Russia's recognition of the so-called DNR and LNR regions of Ukraine as independent states. That violates international law and Russia's own international commitments. And it directly undermines Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, President Biden signed an executive order to respond to President Putin's actions yesterday. And together with our allies and partners, the United States will not hesitate to impose other severe economic costs as events dictate. Now, I know that we've all heard President Putin's speech yesterday, where he threatened war and in attacking the very notion of independent Ukraine. So let's be clear. The U.S. support for Ukraine's self-defense, sovereignty, and territorial integrity is unwavering. Since 2014, the United States has committed more than $2.7 billion in security assistance to Ukraine, including $650 million in 2021 alone. And Mr. Minister, I want to commend you for Ukraine's measured response and for continuing your nation's call for a peaceful diplomatic solution in the face of Russia's aggression, provocations, and false accusations. We will continue to work closely with you and remain in lockstep with our allies and partners in trying to find a way to avoid further conflict. Mr. Putin can still avoid a full-blown tragic war of choice. Now, as you know, I was in Europe last week, and I've never seen NATO more united and more resolute. standing firm as one alliance in support of Ukraine's right to defend its sovereign territory. So, Mr. Minister, thank you again for coming today. It's great to see you back in the Pentagon. We have much to discuss, and I look forward to that and to working closely with you and other Ukrainian leaders to improve our defense partnership and to support our common values of democracy, security, and sovereignty.
Thank you, Secretary. Since Ukraine's independence in 1991, and especially since 2014, the United States have been Ukraine's security partner number one. And every piece of the support that you extended to us in terms of defensive weapons, military equipment, training for our military, for our armed forces, has been deeply appreciated by the people of Ukraine and helped us to build our defensive capacity. I'm on a diplomatic mission here, but these days diplomacy means also defense. And I'm looking forward to discussing with you the continuation of our partnership. And my message is simple: strong Ukraine is the best deterrence of Russia. And we are a peaceful nation. We never attacked anyone. We are not seeking war. We want to find solutions through diplomacy. But if the war is imposed on us by President Putin, we will be defending ourselves. And we will be more than grateful for all the assistance that you can provide to us in that regard. Yesterday's address by President Putin was not about the recognition of Donetsk and Lugansk. It was about the destruction of the Ukrainian statehood. This is how we take it, and this is how we will respond to it. Through diplomacy, with a lot of restraint. We will not fall into provocations arranged by Russia. This is the trap that we will avoid. But again, if we are left no choice, we will be fighting, because this is our land and these are our people. So thank you for this opportunity to see you and to discuss how we can further develop our partnership.
Thank you, President. Thank you, President. Thank you, President. That was it. No questions, please.
At the Pentagon, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba with the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. Great Britain also announcing sanctions against Russia today. BBC News says that 5 banks have had their assets frozen, along with 3 Russian billionaires who will also be hit with UK travel bans. Prime Minister Boris Johnson said Russia's actions amounted to a renewed invasion and the sanctions were a first barrage. The Prime Minister spoke to the members of Parliament in the House of Commons in London.
The House should be in no doubt that the deployment of these forces in sovereign Ukrainian territory amounts to a renewed invasion of that country. And by denying Ukraine's legitimacy as a state and presenting its very existence as a mortal threat to Russia, Putin is establishing the pretext for a full-scale offensive. I think honourable members will struggle to understand to contemplate how in the year 2022, a national leader might calmly and deliberately plot the destruction of a peaceful neighbour. And yet the evidence of his own words suggests that is exactly what President Putin is doing. When I said on Saturday that his scheme to subvert and invade Ukraine was already in motion before our eyes, the events of the last 24 hours have, sadly, shown this to be true. We must now brace ourselves for the next possible stages of Putin's plan. The violent subversion of areas of eastern Ukraine by Russian operatives and their hirelings, followed by a general offensive by the nearly 200,000 Russian troops gathered on the frontiers at peak readiness to attack. If the worst happens, then a European nation of 44 million men, women, and children would become the target of a full-scale war of aggression, waged without a shred of justification for the absurd and even mystical reasons that Putin described last night. Unless the situation changes, the best efforts of the United States, of this country, France, Germany, and other allies to avoid conflict through patient diplomacy may be in vain.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to the House of Commons in London. European Union foreign ministers as well agreeing unanimously to new sanctions on Russia, as Reuters reports it, that will blacklist more politicians, lawmakers, and officials, ban EU investors from trading in Russian state bonds, and target imports and exports with separatist entities. EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, tweeting, "No more shopping in Milano, partying in Saint-Tropez, diamonds in Antwerp. This is a first step. #We Stand United." With more on Russia and Ukraine, we're joined by Luke Coffey, Heritage Foundation Director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy. Thank you very much for being here. A week ago, you wrote, "The success of Ukraine will rest on large part on the shoulders of Ukrainians themselves, but U.S. leadership is essential for counteracting Russian aggression and supporting Ukraine." From what you've seen so far and the sanctions imposed today, is that happening?
No, it's not. And what I meant by the burden is going to be shouldered by the Ukrainians is that they're the ones that are going to have to actually fight to defend their country and fight for their livelihoods. What I meant by the U.S. needing to show leadership and supporting the Ukrainians is that we need to show resolve in terms of our economic sanctions, our diplomatic sanctions, and our willingness to provide defensive weapons and other material to the Ukrainians. And I have to say, the sanctions that were announced today by President Biden, but also by Prime Minister Johnson in the UK, while they were a start, I'm almost reluctant to say a good start, but while they were a start, they do not go far enough considering the gravity of the situation we face.
What else then should the U.S. and the allies be doing?
Well, for example, in the United Kingdom, they announced that 5 banks would be under British sanctions, and then they announced 3 oligarchs by name that would also be under British economic sanctions. Well, these 3 oligarchs have already been on U.S. sanction lists since 2018. In the United States, we announced 2 additional banks will be added to the U.S. list of economic sanctions, but in reality, one of these so-called banks isn't even really a bank. It's more of a financing corporation that's backed by the state to finance infrastructure projects inside Russia. And the other one is Russia's 10th largest bank, but it won't have a direct impact on your average Russian. There are many other bigger banks out there that have been left off the sanctions list. Perhaps this is by design to allow Vladimir Putin an off-ramp. But I think we're beyond off-ramps at this point. You do not deploy 2/3 of your ground forces around a country just to wait, like Russia has done around Ukraine, just to wait for an off-ramp because of a fear of some banks getting sanctioned. So we understand, we can see what Russia is doing, and we should act accordingly. We should make our response proportionate to Russia's aggressive behavior.
You also wrote in your analysis, again, this was a week ago before the developments, the first stop on the road that led to the current crisis in Ukraine was Kabul. What did you mean?
Well, I think when the whole world saw America's departure from Afghanistan, which was a stain on our country's honor and prestige around the world, I think many adversaries and enemies of the United States have become emboldened to test this administration even more, to see just how much it can get away with. And on the flip side of that, many of America's friends and partners and allies around the world saw what happened in Afghanistan, and they're now questioning U.S. resolve and commitment. And you can bet that countries like China are watching how the United States responds to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, because, of course, they have their own designs on Taiwan, for example. You can bet that Iran is watching how the U.S. is responding to Ukraine, because, of course, they are backing proxy militia and terrorist units all across the Middle East that are increasing their numbers of attacks against U.S. partners and allies in the region.
We're talking with Luke Coffey from the Heritage Foundation. For those who are sort of tuning in and new to this and realize there's a crisis out there, but haven't been following it as closely as you have, if somebody asked, why is President Putin so concerned about Ukraine? What's the short answer?
In President Putin's mind, Russia is first and foremost a European country. Vladimir Putin cannot accept the notion that countries that were once under the domination of Imperial Russia or once under the part of the Soviet Union could be independent. So countries like Belarus, countries like Ukraine, Moldova, for example, the Kremlin believes that without control or at least influence in these countries, and Russia is only an Asian country, it's not a European power. And this goes against Putin's mindset on how he sees Russia's role in the world. So this all started back in 2013 and early 2014 when Ukraine simply wanted to sign a free trade deal with the European Union. Russia couldn't even tolerate that, and they invaded and annexed Crimea and started this separatist conflict in eastern Ukraine. 8 years later, we're seeing this all play out once again.
Luke Coffey, Heritage Foundation Director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is Washington Today. Dmitry Trenin is a former officer in Russia military intelligence, left in the early 1990s, and is now director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, think tank affiliated with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Trenin gave his assessment today about President Putin's strategy and next steps after Monday's recognition of those rebel-held areas in eastern Ukraine as independent countries.
Well, I think we are still at the end of the beginning. So this is the end. I thought that the end would be, and I was wrong in that. I thought that the end would be Russia saying we will continue to press for our most important demands: no Ukraine in NATO, no NATO in Ukraine, out with NATO's military infrastructure in Eastern Europe. But at the same time, it would sit down with the United States to talk about arms control issues, confidence-building issues, based on the exchanges that the Foreign Ministry and the State Department have had over the past few weeks. That, to me, looked a pretty credible scenario. Instead, Mr. Putin has opted for the recognition of the Donbass republics, which basically means that Russia is ceding the moral high ground, at least in Russian eyes, of being faithful to the Minsk agreement, while the other side, Ukraine in particular, was not fulfilling its obligations. This all happened against the background of renewed shelling in Donbass and the evacuation of Donbass residents into Russia ordered by the republics. So the origins of all that, again, are uncertain for a lot of people. But clearly this was how Mr. Putin decided to end this phase. My theory at this point, again, this is nothing more than a theory. Mr. Putin, for 3 months, starting in November and all the way to where we are now, has been trying through concentration of military forces around Ukraine and the demonstration of his own resolve to use those forces in Ukraine, was trying to get the West to give him what he demanded, and also to get the United States in particular to lean hard on Ukraine, on President Zelensky and Kiev more broadly, to start implementing Minsk. And I think in the last few days, he took a decision that there was nothing to be extracted from the United States on the most important issues, and in particular on the issue of Minsk. So Minsk was not going to be implemented. And I think this is the way, and again, this is only my conjecture at this point, this is the way he decided to end the first phase, the beginning of his operation, to end on a high note, if you like, to de-escalate by escalating.
Dmitry Trenin, director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, at today's virtual discussion hosted by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Washington Today continues in a moment.
I can report to the nation, America is on the move again.
Live Tuesday, March 1st, the State of the Union. President Biden addresses a joint session of Congress and the nation, reflecting on his first year in office and laying out his agenda for the year ahead. Live coverage begins at 8 p.m. Eastern. The President speaks at 9, followed by the Republican response, and will take your phone calls and social media reaction. The State of the Union Address, live Tuesday, March 1st at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN, cspan.org, or on the C-SPAN Now video app.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. A few more headlines. U.S. Capitol Police and the Washington, D.C. Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency both asking the Pentagon to deploy D.C. National Guard ahead of President Biden's first State of the Union address next week. And that's when truck convoy protests could arrive, blocking streets similar to what happened in Ottawa, Canada. Pentagon spokesman John Kirby says no decision yet on whether to approve that request. Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds will be delivering the Republican response to President Biden's State of the Union address, a joint announcement today by the House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy and the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. They cite the governor's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and signing a law that prohibits schools from teaching critical race theory, examining the legacy of slavery in U.S. society. U.S. Supreme Court denying an appeal by former President Trump to keep his White House records from the U.S. House Select Committee investigating the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, and the Supreme Court agreeing to take a major challenge to the anti-discrimination laws by considering whether a Colorado web designer has a free speech right to refuse service to couples planning same-sex weddings. President Joe Biden announcing some actions today by the government and private industry designed to strengthen the critical mineral supply chain. Those minerals used in everything from electric vehicles and batteries to solar panels, wind turbines, electronics, and some defense systems. The president holding a meeting in the Eisenhower Executive Office building next to the White House.
We're announcing a major investment in domestic production of key minerals and materials. Today, as I mentioned, China controls most of the global market in these minerals. And the fact that we can't build a future that's made in America if we ourselves are dependent on China for the materials that power the products of today and tomorrow. And this is not anti-China or anti-anything else. It's pro-American. That's why I'm taking action. Through the Department of Defense, and I have a Deputy Secretary to my, there you go, I thought to my right, the governor's to my, the Deputy Secretary is here. We're investing $35 million in MP materials, currently America's only rare earth mining and processing operation, to help create a fully domestic supply chain for the magnets that power electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, and so much more. We know that when the federal government invests in innovation, it powers up the private sector to do what they do best. And that's what we're seeing happen. MP Materials is announcing a $700 million investment in the magnet supply chain, creating 350 good-paying jobs. Berkshire Hathaway Energy, renewables, is breaking ground for a new facility this spring in your state. I know Gavin knows more about this than I do, but in California, to test the new process to pull lithium, which is used for batteries, for phones, for cars, for underground sources in California, Imperial Valley, in a way that's environmentally sustainable. And last week, Redwood Materials announced a partnership with Ford and Volvo to recycle lithium-ion batteries, so you'll be able to produce more of those batteries, taking out the minerals and reprocessing them so they can be used to power electric vehicles, reducing the need for new mining.
President Biden hosting a virtual meeting from the Eisenhower Executive Office building, part of the White House complex, as he referenced, also attending the U.S. Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm, his National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks, and California Governor Gavin Newsom. On Wall Street today, the Dow down 482, NASDAQ down 166, S&P down 44. Many of the analysts pointing to the tensions between Russia and Ukraine as a cause. Associated Press from Brunswick, Georgia has this. The 3 white men convicted of murder of Ahmaud Arbery's fatal shooting were found guilty of federal hate crimes Tuesday for violating Arbery's civil rights and targeting him because he was black. The jury also found father and son Greg and Travis McMichael and neighbor William Roddy Bryan guilty of attempted kidnapping, and the McMichaels guilty of the use of a firearm in the commission of a violent crime. Weeks prior to the trial, the McMichaels had both agreed to enter guilty pleas to the hate crimes in exchange for being able to serve their sentences in federal rather than state prison. That was from the Associated Press. Outside the courthouse today, some reaction from the mother of Ahmaud Arbery, Wanda Cooper Jones, about that possible plea.
I now want to address the members of the DOJ. I'm very thankful that you guys brought these charges of hate crime. But back on January the 31st, you guys accepted a plea deal with these 3 murderers who took my son's life. Marcus and 2 of Ahmaud's aunties stood before the courts and begged the judge not to take a plea deal that the DOJ went before the judge and asked them to take a plea deal with these guys. That's a mother. Attorney Ben Crump just called these women, just called her name, Kristen Clark. As I traveled to Brunswick on that Sunday afternoon, I spoke to Kristen Clark and the lead attorney, Tara Lyons, begging them to please not take this plea deal. They ignored my cry. I begged them. Even after the family stood before the judge and asked the judge to not take this plea deal, the lead prosecutor, Tara Lyons, stood up and asked the judge to ignore the family's cry. Justice. That's not justice for Ahmaud. Come on. What we got today, we wouldn't have gotten today if it wasn't for the fight that the family put up on January the 31st. What the DOJ did today, they was made to do today. Come on. It wasn't because what they wanted to do. They were made to do their job today.
Wanda Cooper Jones, the mother of Ahmaud Arbery, outside the courthouse in Brunswick, Georgia, referring to Kristen Clark, who is the Assistant U.S. Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division. In Washington, D.C., at the Justice Department, the Attorney General Merrick Garland asked about the criticism from Arbery's mother.
Wanda Jones, who you mentioned, said at a press conference after this verdict that was in that essentially justice was served because the family pushed in court to have a judge reject this plea deal. That's the only reason justice was served. What's your response to that? And then on a sort of unrelated topic, last week the National
Wait, can we do one question?
Yeah, we'll start with that.
Thank you. On your first question, I cannot imagine the pain that a mother feels to have her son run down and then gunned down while taking a jog on a public street. My heart goes out to her and to the family. That's really all I can say about this.
The Attorney General Merrick Garland at the Justice Department. He called this news conference to react to the guilty verdicts in the federal hate crimes case. And here's part of what he said in his opening statement.
The Justice Department does not investigate or prosecute people because of their ideology or the views they hold, no matter how vile. But the Justice Department does have the authority and will not hesitate to act when individuals commit violent acts that are motivated by bias or hate. No one in this country should have to fear the threat of hate-fueled violence. No one should fear being attacked or threatened because of what they look like, where they are from, whom they love, or how they worship. And no one should fear that if they go out for a run, they will be targeted and killed because of the color of their skin. The Justice Department has a legal obligation to prosecute hate crimes. And as Americans, all of us have a moral obligation to combat the hatred and bigotry that motivates those crimes. Today's verdict makes clear that the Justice Department will continue to use every resource at its disposal to confront unlawful acts of hate and to hold accountable those who perpetrate them. I want to thank the members of the Civil Rights Division, the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Georgia, and the FBI for their work on this case. I also want to thank the jurors for their service and the state authorities, including the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, that assisted in this prosecution. Although we welcome the jury's verdict, the only acceptable outcome in this matter would have been Mr. Arbery returning safely to his loved ones 2 years ago. His family and his friends should be preparing to celebrate his 28th birthday later this spring, not mourning the second anniversary of his death tomorrow. Ahmaud Arbery should be alive today.
Attorney General Merrick Garland, news conference at the Justice Department in Washington. Associated Press article also has this: the verdict, handed down one day before the second anniversary of Arbery's death on February 23, 2020, was a symbolic one, coming just months after all three defendants were convicted of murder in a Georgia state court and sentenced to life in prison. From the New York Times, Paul Farmer, a physician, anthropologist, and humanitarian who gained global acclaim for his work delivering high-quality health care to some of the world's poorest people, died on Monday on the grounds of a hospital and university he had helped establish in Rwanda. He was 62. He was a practitioner of social medicine, arguing that there was no point in treating patients for diseases only to send them back into the desperate circumstances that contributed to them in the first place. That from the New York Times. Paul Farmer was on C-SPAN several times over the years, including this in 2013. He had just written a book titled To Repair the World. Paul Farmer Speaks to the Next Generation. Here he talks about what it's like trying to help others in other countries, but coming in as an outsider.
If you go back to first principles, how do you acknowledge your own privilege? I mean, if you're working with, poor farmers, the ones with the hose, not, like my last name, then you're probably in a very inegalitarian dyad, right? I got that all the time in Haiti. You're rich, they're poor. You're white, they're black. Sometimes you're well, they're sick. Being honest about those power differentials is really hard to do. And it's painful, right? Because you don't want to be, a lot of people do want to be in unequal dyads, but a lot of people don't. And of course, you could come right back to this country close to your elderly parents and see pretty striking disparities here too, as you all know, as we all agree. So I think that being honest about that, and it doesn't have to be a loud exercise, it can be a private or even spiritual exercise to think about that, reflect on it. It's always better when you're thinking about these things with others. And just remember that humility and sometimes being quiet. Now, I haven't done a lot of that tonight, but humility and being quiet in some setting other than place where you're an outsider is a good thing to do. As physicians, we've often had a very warm welcome that other outsiders don't enjoy. I've had that in prisons in Russia, where I can't tell you how pleasant it has been to work in prisons in Russia and Siberia, where because of the collegiality extended to me as an outsider. Rwanda's a tough place. After what happened there, you don't expect it not to be difficult. Haiti has a very freighted relationship with one country above all others, and that is mine. Guatemala, the highlands of Guatemala, working with indigenous people. The ones I work with, their ire was actually turned to local elites much more than us, the doctors who were on their side. So I do believe, too, that we may get off a little in the sense of it is assumed, if you're a doctor or nurse or direct service provider, that you could offer something of value.
Dr. Paul Farmer on his book, To Repair the World, speaking in 2013 at the 6th and I Historic Synagogue in Washington, D.C. That from C-SPAN 2's Book TV. You can find the full program at our video library at cspan.org. Dr. Farmer died on Monday at the age of 62 while working at a hospital in Rwanda. Lots of tributes coming in. This from Samantha Power, current administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. She tweeted on Monday, "Devastating news. Paul Farmer gave everything to others. He saw the worst and yet did all he could to bring out the best in everyone he encountered. Indefatigable, mischievous, generous, brilliant, soulful, skeptical, idealistic, beloved, a giant." That tweet from Samantha Power. Thanks for joining us on Washington Today. You can get more top Washington stories sent to you each day with C-SPAN's evening newsletter, Word for Word. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.